Today, I'm going to talk about Halo Infinite. You might be wondering, why the hell are you making a video about Halo Infinite? Elden Ring is the big thing now. Well, I didn't get to play Infinite until January. I finished it in February, and then there's the whole process of making a video, which takes me a long time. I'm still not entirely happy with this one, but, I gotta get it out there. I don't generally make videos about games. I'm kind of making an exception here because Halo is a series that's very near and dear to my heart. I love it a lot. It's a very important release, Halo Infinite, to the series, arguably the most important release ever, and I honestly have some mixed feelings about it. So in this video, I'm only going to cover the campaign. I'm not going to cover the multiplayer. They're kind of separate products. I haven't played enough of the multiplayer, and this video is already stupidly long. It would be way too long if I tried to cover multiplayer too. I will get kind of critical in this video at times. I tend to overemphasize the bad. I'm not trying to dump all over this game. And I will try to maintain a bit of a distinction between things that aren't necessarily bad, but just kind of weren't for me. I didn't like them personally. Things that aren't even bad or wrong, but just feel like a missed opportunity or something that could have been better, and things that I am coming down hard on that I definitely think were flaws with the games. Ultimately, this is a thoughts video. It's not a critical review or deep analysis. It's just what I think. Overall, I think Halo Infinite is a good game, but also a flawed one, and some of those flaws are minor, but some of them are pretty big. So just a quick note on spoilers. I will try to avoid specific spoilers, and especially spoilers for the ending, but there is some stuff that I'm going to talk about and show that does come from later in the game. So if you're super sensitive about spoilers and you don't want anything spoiled at all for you, you haven't played the game, it might be better to go play it and then come back and watch this video after you're done. Let's start off with the good part. Halo Infinite's core gameplay is good. It's really good. The movement and the gunplay are great. Gunplay in particular is it's definitely the best of any Halo game to date. This is something I think 343 doesn't really get credit for often enough. With Infinite, they are getting credit for it. It is being praised, and they absolutely deserve it. I do take minor issue with some choices in the weapon sandbox. The VK-88 just feels worse than the battle rifle. The Sentinel beam has this weird range damage drop-off to it. And I'm a bit disappointed that some of my personal favorites, like the DMR and the Needle rifle, didn't come back this time around. But honestly, those are minor complaints. Overall, it's very well balanced. Got lots of great weapons to work with. The grappling hook is a ton of fun tactically. It opens up lots of opportunities for movement, going up, going around, and the melee features they've added with the grappling hook, being able to latch onto enemies and slam into them or board vehicles with it, are just a lot of fun. I do think it's kind of awkward that the grappling hook is just equipment and doesn't have its own key. I very rarely used anything other than the grappling hook because it's just so useful. You want to keep that equipped so you can fire it off at a moment's notice. There's also a lot of debate over whether sprint should be in Halo Infinite. It does have sprint. Personally, I like it. I don't really want to go into it further than that. Look, this is the most important part of a game, the core mechanics. And while I can't fully dismiss the other flaws that I will get into later in this video, having solid core mechanics goes a long way towards compensating for them. Even if you're slogging through a section which is maybe not great, if at least the combat is fun and you're enjoying that part of it, it makes it a lot easier. I will get a little harsher towards certain things in this video, but it's important to keep that in mind, that it does get this right. Halo Infinite is an open world game. It's 343's first open world game, and honestly, for a first time, it's pretty good. But the elephant in the room, of course, is that it's not the only open world game out there. And it just, at least to me, doesn't live up to the standards set by other franchises. I found myself comparing it a little bit to Far Cry, a bit to Just Cause, a little bit to Crackdown for various reasons, and I am using those examples because those are all games that I've played. But all of those do at least something better than Halo Infinite, and arguably they do almost everything in that open world sandbox better than Halo Infinite. There's a lot of what I feel are rookie mistakes in Halo Infinite's open world sandbox. I had a long list, cut it for time. It's basically small annoyances. The one that I'm explicitly going to point out is that the motion tracker is not a mini-map, and the actual world map is slow to come up and does not pause the game, which is an issue for a reason that I'm going to get into a bit later. I'm going to say that a lot in this video. It's not the big issue, though. The big issue with Halo Infinite, big problem number one that I'm going to point out, extends across both the open world and the story missions, and that is repetitiveness. The greatest sin in Halo Infinite is that there is not enough variety. In the open world, the fact that it is a singular biome with multiple regions that all basically look and feel the same, that is an issue. It's not the biggest issue. The biggest issue is the side missions. There's 3 or 4 different types of them, but generally every mission of a given type plays the same. It has a similar sort of arena in which it's taking place, the same objectives, the same enemies that come in the same order. It's fun the first time. Each one of those missions is fun the first time, but it gets old quick. There's also not enough options for engagement, not enough ways to play this. You can pick how you're going to kick it off, whether you're going to bring in a vehicle if you can, which power weapon you're going to bring in if you're at the point where you can just grab those. But every encounter inevitably seems to devolve into the same thing. It's a drawn-out slugfest with bullet sponge enemies. There's nothing like a well-developed stealth system which would let you sneak around and take them out one by one. There's no alarms that you could stop or destroy. If you take those out first, it reduces the number of enemies. Vehicles, like I said, I'll get into that in a moment. So what about the story missions? I mentioned there's also an issue with those. Again, it's the same issue. There's too many levels that are basically the same. Expect long, bland Forerunner corridors with encounters that run pretty much the same way every time. The first one is fun. It's even epic the first time you see these Forerunner environments and get into these fights, but it gets old very fast because it's basically the same thing over and over again. There's too many of these corridor runs, and one thing that's really missing is the epic set-piece Halo moments. We do get a few of them, but not as many of them as something like Halo 3, and they're not as memorable. And with both the open world side missions and the main story missions, there's just enough deviation from the norm to really make the lack of variety felt. The opening mission, the opening story mission aboard of a spaceship is really good. It's different, it's interesting, it's fun. There's another mission very late in the campaign which takes place in a brute tower. It's not perfect. I think that mission does have a few issues with it, but it's at least something different from the Forerunner corridors. As for side missions, there's one that stands out. It's set in a cave. It's a marine rescue mission. You have to rescue these marines, but you have to fight your way through the Banished to rescue them rather than jumping in and shooting everyone defending them. There's enough missions like that are just a little bit different from the norm, that have that variety to make you really feel, I wish they all had this level of variety. And to me, by the end of Halo Infinite, it really felt like a slog, like I was just doing the same thing and grinding, basically. So I mentioned vehicles, and I'm going to make vehicles its own little mini section. I'm going to call this a slightly smaller problem. Not a huge sin, but a pretty major problem, which is that vehicles are underutilized. So you'd think vehicles are a big part of Halo. When Halo came out in 2001, it was super cool and new and different and awesome to have vehicles in a first-person shooter. Vehicles are also a big part of open-world games, all the way back to the pioneers like the original GTA. So why the hell are vehicles so de-emphasized in Halo Infinite? You'd think the game didn't want you to use them. So there's not a lot of enemy vehicles or just vehicles sitting there out in the world. The terrain for driving around is pretty bad. There's not many roads and a lot of things you can get stuck on, a lot of very steep hills you can't take vehicles up. And again, as I mentioned earlier, you have no mini-map and a map that's almost unusable while you're driving and being shot at. You don't get good vehicles until later. Vehicles can't be delivered to you. You can only pick them up at FOBs. And there are vanishingly few vehicle sequences in story missions. Now, it is worth mentioning that when you get vehicles and where you can use them, they're a ton of fun, which just kind of makes that oversight or omission feel that much worse. They're awesome, but they're not used. Now, I think they may have designed around vehicles instead of for vehicles. There is a vehicle you get late in the campaign called the Wasp. It's a flying machine. You can take it places, you can't take other vehicles, and it kind of breaks how I think a lot of encounters were meant to be played. So I feel that they just didn't really design the game around vehicles, which to me is baffling. Again, this doesn't destroy the game, it's still fun, but it's just kinda baffling that they do this. So other miscellaneous comments about the level design. Halo's level design, and some people are going to get really mad at me in the comments for saying this. In 2001, Halo Combat Evolved's level design was okay. It wasn't amazing even in 2001. And using that same sort of level design in 2021 is completely unacceptable. Even if Halo Infinite was less repetitive, if they'd only done the Forerunner corridor things once, it would still be pretty drab and boring. I do appreciate that in places they have tried to add some detail and some objects of interest to these. Mostly, I just kind of found the level design boring. There's also a bit of a missed opportunity here, which I'm entirely going to chalk up to inexperience with the genre, which is they didn't really leverage the open world for story missions. There's one or two that take place in small segments of the open world, but there's nothing like some sequences in Saints Row or even Far Cry, where you're in a vehicle and you're driving down these roads that you drive between missions on, only you're chasing someone, for instance. I also do, and this is entirely a personal preference thing, wish we had companions in story missions. I really liked the narrative integrated co-op in 3 and 5. You had the Arbiter with you in 3, and in Halo 5 you always had 3 other squad mates with you, whether they were AI or human, depending on whether you're playing co-op or not. Also wish that Marines weren't such glass cannons here and that they were more useful and could go where you could go. I've kind of mixed feelings about the boss fights. There's a lot of boss fights in this game, which is kind of new to Halo, although I think Halo 4 and 5 were starting to play with that. For the most part, I liked them. There's quite a bit of variety to them, but I do think there's a bit of an over-reliance on those to make things interesting in lieu of everything else. And another personal preference thing is that I felt there were just too many enemies in a lot of encounters. Were they trying to make up for something, or maybe it was just balanced for co-op? I can't quite put my finger on why this bugs me, but I just wasn't a fan of it. I think it made every encounter just kind of drawn out and too long. Weirdly enough, this was less of an issue towards the end of the game. It was a bigger issue towards the beginning of the game, so maybe I just sucked. I should point out one thing, which is that especially in the beginning of the game, Halo Infinite does have that epic Halo feel to it. I think the best comparison, and this is a good one, is the level Halo in Halo CE. Unfortunately, it kind of gets replaced by a bit of an empty enemy as the game goes on. My second big beef with Halo Infinite is that it's not Halo 6. And if I was going for views, that's what I would call this video. That's what I would use as the clickbait title. So Infinite takes almost everything 343 had built up to this point and throws it away. They didn't just throw the baby out with the bathwater, they kind of tore the whole bathroom out. So on the surface, that smooth futuristic design language is gone. It's much more like CE or Reach. Okay, fine. But narratively, all those characters that were introduced in 4 and 5 don't show up outside of audio logs, and only in some cases. It doesn't really follow 4 and 5 thematically, and this to me is the worst part, it does not pick up the cliffhanger at the end of Halo 5. That entire conflict that we spent all of Halo 5 and arguably a big part of Halo 4 setting up for is resolved almost entirely off screen. So look, imagine if there was no Avengers Endgame. Thanos does the snap in Infinity War, and then the next movie is Spider-Man Far From Home. They kind of explain here and there that, yeah, Thanos was defeated, that happened, the snap was undone, there was a big fight. Can we please focus on this new thing now? And to me, not having a good conclusion to that cliffhanger, or in this case not having one at all, retroactively makes the previous games worse. We had all that build-up and there's no payoff. If we had had Halo 6 and it was good, it would make, okay, it wouldn't make Halo 5 great, but at least you'd kind of tolerate it since it was building up to this amazing thing. Instead, Halo 5 and to a lesser extent Halo 4 almost feel pointless because you know all that build-up is going to go to nothing. I don't feel what they did here is objectively forgivable. but how much it really matters to you is going to depend on how much you were invested in 343's Halo. I think a big chunk of the fan base never really cared about these new storylines, and for them, this doesn't really matter. If anything, it's a good thing. But for me and the other person who actually liked those games, despite their flaws, it honestly feels like a punch to the gut. It's been emphasized pretty heavily in the marketing for Halo Infinite that Master Chief is back and he is front and center this time. That's probably a smart decision given that Master Chief basically is Halo. He's on all the covers, and if you showed someone a picture of Master Chief who's casually familiar with the series, they'd be like, yep, that's Mr. Halo. At the same time, I totally understand why 343 was trying to move away from Chief in the first place. That he's Bungie's creation and not 343's notwithstanding, he's just kind of a difficult character to write for and work with. He has no face, literally, and a deliberately limited vocal range, which makes it hard to convey emotion. You totally can, but you have to write around it. He was, I think, once intended as more of a blank slate for the player to project into, but he hasn't been that for many years. He's had his own distinct characterization, his own distinct stories, and of course that means he has a certain legend attached to him with a lot of fan expectations. Again, all of this stuff is stuff that you can write around or write for, but you have to do that. I kind of look at Halo 5 as an unsuccessful experiment. I think the timing was good to bring in new blood. At that point, Chief and the Chief Cortana duo had a great trilogy, Halo 1, 2, and 3, with a mixed bag, but I thought it was decent post-scriptum, Halo 4. I don't think 343 did a good job with it, and they certainly didn't do a good enough job to convince a reluctant fan base that this was the way to go. I do worry sometimes that Master Chief is going to eventually become a boat anchor that weighs the franchise down. Before you jump down my throat for saying that, look at Wolfenstein. Look at BJ Blazkowicz in Wolfenstein. There are 2 to 3 points in the series. You know the ones I'm talking about if you've played the games. If you haven't, I'm not going to spoil them, where he really should have died. Like they were setting up for a death, and he should not have made it past that point. But each time they pulled a Deus Ex Machina to keep him alive and pivoted away from what should have been a really pivotal, dramatic narrative moment, which honestly robbed the story of those games. And that's the last thing I want to see with Master Chief. The last thing I want to see is him becoming the ball and chain which weighs the series down. And I think I speak for most of the fan base when I say, if that time comes, send him out with a bang. Now, to be clear, Halo Infinite is not that game. We are not there yet. At the same time, I don't think they did a great job with Master Chief, especially early on in the game. I found the way he was characterized early on, frankly, off-putting. He has this stoic machismo, which honestly came across as arrogance to me. The situation at that point is completely fucked, but Chief is kind of like, yeah, I got this, I can fix everything. It feels like he's bought into his own legend, and that seems to apply to, at least early on, the game in 343 as well. They've kind of bought into Chief's legend in the narrative in a way that feels kind of self-indulgent and unaware. Look, Chief is good. He is really good, and he's lucky, something that no other Spartan has, and he was in a lot of important places at a lot of important times. But the whole literally better than the entire fleet and the rest of the Spartans combined, savior of the UNSC, sole guy who saved the world thing, that's a meme. That's not lore. Arguably, the series was never Chief doing it alone, not even in CE. He always had Johnson. In Halo 2, you bring in the Arbiter, also in Halo 3, Lasky in Halo 4, and of course, better for worse, the fire teams in Halo 5. In Halo Infinite, you're kind of left thinking, okay, we're gonna save the galaxy, but what happened to everybody else? Now, to be clear, later in the game, it gets way better. 343 does a total author saving throw here. We see a much more nuanced Chief who is arguably broken and definitely deeply affected by the loss of Cortana. We do start to hear about some other things that are going on. There are still a few moments where Chief just does stuff which seems to make no sense. It is explained later, but I think this is more related to the player has to pick up the pieces characters don't issue than characterization of the Chief. The story honestly started off pretty rough to me. I was salty about that cliffhanger that didn't get picked up to begin with. just not a fan of the one man against the world narrative. I thought the story was overly simplistic in general, and a step back from the more nuanced and complex narratives that they were trying to do, arguably failed completely at doing, but tried to do in 4 and 5. It felt like a cliche storm of 90s action movie tropes that just doesn't cut it in 2021. It's not horrendous, nothing was horrendous, but it just didn't hold a lot of appeal to me. I think part of this is the villains. The Banished, I don't like them. They've always struck me as a literal straw man villain. They come from nowhere and are exactly as strong as the plot demands. In Halo Wars 2, they were apparently once a threat bigger than the UNSC to the Covenant, but then they get their asses handed to them by an outdated Gator carrier, a couple Spartans, and a logistics AI. The big bad guy, Escharum, I found him ridiculously hammy. There are some mid-game reveals that add some depth to his character, but he still feels one-dimensional for most of the game. And I do take exception to one point where Chief says he's just a soldier doing what he thought was right, because we don't really see that. We just see a total bastard whose motivation is solely revenge, and he's willing to commit numerous war crimes to get there. Contrast that with some of the other series villains whose motivations and goals were, at least in their minds, noble. Also found the tone of Halo Infinite a bit weird. Halo has always been campier than a lot of us would like to admit, but previous games did a better job balancing the silly and serious. This time, there's one instance in the game where Escharum has this huge, large ham Saturday morning cartoon villain rant moment, and then like a couple minutes later, the pilot dude has what honestly to me was a kind of scary looking mental breakdown. And Infinite kind of struggles to balance these throughout the entire game. So all those issues are kind of subjective and relatively minor, but there is one not huge problem, but significant problem, which I would like to highlight, and that is Halo Infinite does too much telling and not enough showing. One of the big rules of writing is show, don't tell. There's just a lot of telling and not a lot of showing. There's this element of everything's gone to shit and you're left putting the pieces together to the story, kind of like ODST, but unlike ODST, this only applies to the player. The characters know what's happened, the player does not, which creates this disconnect, and I think that really doesn't help this problem of telling and not showing. Now, the good news is that the story gets a lot better. Don't judge a book by its cover absolutely applies here. About midway through the game, they took Chief's character in a different direction than was originally presented, and a little different than what I expected, and they did explain what had happened between Halo 5 and now. It's not part of the game, but they did tie the events into the events of this one, at least a little bit, in a pretty significant way. I'd say more than a little bit, and they made the whole conflict personal for the characters. They never fully fixed the issues that I've pointed out, but they became less and less important and better compensated for as the plot went on. I did really like both supporting characters. It's a very sparse cast. I liked the pilot, Echo 216. I've seen some people hate on him for not being that stoic dude bro archetype, but I love the perspective of this guy who's just kind of caught up in this shit. He didn't want to be there, he was never supposed to be there, but he just kind of got caught up in it. There is a big reveal, which I think is going to make some people think less of him. That's fair. Personally, I don't hold it against him. I do feel some of the other characters give him a free pass when they should not have. But he does evoke sympathy within the universe as well, so, The weapon can kind of be summarized as a younger, more childish Cortana. They do have this kind of weird hangout up about names now that I think of it. The pilot's name isn't revealed until near the end of the game, and I don't remember it offhand. Maybe I'll throw it in the video as a subtitle. This was treated as a pretty significant reveal, and it sort of was, but then it just kind of felt awkward. It's like, wait, we didn't know his name until now? And the weapon does get a name actually around the same time, but that one isn't revealed, and honestly, I'm not going to say what I think it is, because it is a spoiler, but I hope it's not going to end up being what they implied it to be. They are obviously trying to set up a dynamic between Chief and the weapon. It's very much like what Chief and Cortana had. So far, I actually like what they've been doing. It's very much the same, but at the same time, it's not quite the same. It's new and different. It's similar, but distinct. Now, 343 does need to be careful to keep it that way and not end up just rehashing the same thing. Another thing, when I sit and think about it, doesn't make a ton of sense, is the timeline. 6 months from the prologue to the real beginning of the game, how is anyone still alive? Where are all these Marines coming from? Where do these vehicles come from? The supplies. In dialogue, it's stated midway through the game that it's 7 hours later, but this is after many, many, many in-game day-night cycles. Although it almost lines up to my playtime at that point, so maybe the day-night cycle is actually supposed to be real-time? I've always maintained that the beginning and the end are the most important parts of any story. And while the beginning didn't really do it for me, the end did. The final mission and the ending, they were genuinely satisfying, they were genuinely enjoyable. They did a pretty good job of tying off the loose ends while clearly setting up for a bigger conflict. That's another reason why I'd say Halo Infinite is really Halo 7 and not Halo 6. It has an ending and it does tie things off, but it's absolutely more of a beginning. There is a bit of an elephant in the room. I did not realize the Harbinger was not a Forerunner until someone told me after the game was over. So my understanding of the whole Endless thing at the end of the game was that the Endless were Forerunner criminals in stasis. Zeta Halo was basically a prison. It's conjecture, but it was reasonable given what I knew. It's wrong. I'm not going to say what is actually going on, spoilers, but it's not that. In other words, there's at least one critical plot point this game just didn't make clear enough. Apparently it's explained in the audio logs. I didn't listen to the audio logs because I thought they were very awkwardly implemented, and I was always in a firefight when I picked them up. This is another thing that I'm not really willing to give 343 a pass on. Look, important story information needs to be in the game proper, not the bonus materials. While I said I liked where the story eventually ended up, I'm basing that on how I understood it, which ultimately is all I can do. But how much of it did I really understand? I'm going to touch on the audio and visuals. I feel like I have to, even though this isn't a review and isn't meant to be a review. So, sound design and sound engineering is one place where 343 has just always been better than Bungie. And you know, Marty O'Donnell deserves credit for the really iconic music that Bungie's games had, as do the voice actors for their work, but the actual sound effects and audio engineering was never great. To some extent, the industry has advanced, to a great extent, really, but I've always kind of felt that Bungie was behind the curve, while 343 is, if not ahead of the curve, at least on it. So this time around, the music makes great use of old tunes, old leitmotifs, remixed into new tracks. The audio isn't incredible, it's not the best I've heard in the game. That honor goes to Battlefield 1, still. But it's competent, it's satisfying, and the weapon sounds, both small arms and vehicles, do deserve special praise. For graphics, I don't get hung up on graphics these days. Pretty much every game is at least good enough to me and has been for half a decade, so Halo Infinite looks fine, I guess. It's clear when you look closely at certain things, like the weapon lighting and the soft shadows, they're burning a lot of electrons here, but there's also stuff like very visible pop-in and weird clipping that I thought were solved issues by now. You know, basically, it didn't blow me away, it wasn't bad. To me, visual style matters more than graphics quality. I did run into some performance issues, but I think this was my fault. We're getting towards the end of the video, but I'm going to ramble just a little bit longer. So was going open world a good idea? I think 343 could have pulled off a great traditional Halo game. Maybe misplaced confidence, but I have confidence in them. And I would have preferred to play that game. But if they never took any risks, the franchise would inevitably stagnate and get boring. So even though it didn't fully work out this time, I'm kind of glad they did take that risk and did try to do something different. Now, should they have stuck with what they started in terms of continuing 4 and 5 versus starting a new storyline? I would have preferred that, to be honest, and I think from a purely creative integrity standpoint, it would have been better for them to stick to their guns, but I don't think they really had a choice here. They had to win back the crowd, and Halo 5 is baggage. With Infinite, they've wanted to take the series back to its roots, Halo CE. Thing is, I think a lot of people view CE with rose-colored glasses. It was innovative for the time. It had some great ideas. Parts of it still hold up today, but it was also super janky, had a ton of early installment weirdness, and was absolutely loaded with tedious 90s shooter bullshit. If I was to pick a game as a template, it would be 3, not CE. Now, I'm not sure how much 343 really used CE as a template versus later games in the series, but I do see the good and the bad of CE in Infinite. It was rumored that Halo Infinite was rushed, not privy to what was going on behind the scenes. I don't want to go too much into rumors I can't confirm. I will say that if it was rushed, that explains a lot of the flaws, but doesn't excuse them. And there is another big elephant in the room, which is co-op. We didn't get co-op on launch, and honestly, I think if the game had co-op, a lot of the issues which soured it for me wouldn't be so much of a problem. And I do wonder if they deliberately dropped or deprioritized other features thinking, yeah, most players are going to play in co-op and it's not going to matter so much, and then at the 11th hour they had to drop co-op as well. 343 has stated they have a 10-year plan for Halo Infinite. Isn't that some kind of communist thing, 10-year plan? With regular campaign updates coming. We don't know what we're going to get at this point. We don't know what the structure of it's going to be, or perhaps most crucially, if it's going to cost more versus being free DLC. So I'm just going to throw out some random things that I am hoping to see. Number one, more variety in everything, but especially in that environment and encounter design. That's the biggest issue with Halo Infinite. That's the easiest thing, I think, to address in future installments. I'd like to see more use of vehicles and more big set pieces, those Halo moments, those epic Halo moments I remember. I'd like to keep seeing bosses, but not so many of them. They range from kind of meh to really excellent in Halo Infinite, but they were kind of on the edge of being overused here, so maybe one per chapter. The sandbox is pretty good. I'd like to see some minor tweaks to it, but, limit it to those minor tweaks. It works pretty well as is, but a new weapon or enemy here and there to keep it fresh is not going to hurt. Definitely need to see more progression. What we had in Halo Infinite worked pretty well. Not amazing, good enough, but even I, a mediocre player who didn't do everything, maxed out my levels in this game alone. So if there's going to be more game, there needs to be more room to progress. I'd like to see companions. I'd ideally like to see established characters come back. You can see what happened to them, maybe give them missions of their own. Kind of cliched patterns, but they work. And finally, I'd like to see us leave Zeta Halo. I know Zeta Halo and adventures on this ring is at least the near-term plan, but there's lots of room on the ring, but 10 years is a long time to be stuck there, and there's clearly a wider conflict happening out in the galaxy, and it would be a shame to never see that. In general, I think the foundation is solid enough to build on. The core gameplay loop, which is the most important part, is good. All the elements there work, even if they aren't always used effectively. The narrative, kind of take it or leave it, but the ending is solid and it's good enough to build something off of. I am skeptical of whether 343 can deliver. That's kind of the bigger question in my mind. So far, they've been a lot better at starting stuff than finishing it, and Halo Infinite in and of itself is evidence of that. Now they say it's a new beginning, it's a new studio, it's different this time. So I'm hopeful. I'm skeptical, but I'm hopeful. I think my overall opinion of Halo Infinite is the same as a lot of releases these days. It's fine. I really wish I could be more enthusiastic about it. I really wish I could be as enthusiastic about Halo Infinite as a lot of other fans seem to be. And there's a possibility that it is a me thing. I'm just a lot more jaded and cynical and hard to impress these days. But look, does Halo Infinite live up to the hype? No. I would argue that it doesn't. Not to me, certainly, and I'm not surprised by that. Very few games do live up to the hype, even ones that are very good. Is it still an enjoyable game? Is it still a good game? Absolutely. I do think it has shortcomings, but I had a lot of fun with it anyway, and at the end, I was sad that it was over, which is possibly the most important, biggest indication of whether this was a good experience. If 343 can build on what they have and address the weaknesses, they could make something really great.